you see everybody see the first slide then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. All good.
Okay, great. So basically, I started to develop this discussion some time ago to assist my colleagues who might not have had any or inadequate design and art history education. So town planners, other property professionals, and dare I say some students. And I did this in an attempt to help them with the basis from which one might start to talk about design issues and to try to understand somewhat design decision-making. It's to help understand better the design decision-making process and to establish a grounding for discussions about design and particularly relevant to architecture. It's an attempt to enhance understanding and appreciation of what's behind the decisions we may take when making a building and place. This is not with a view to create some sort of prescriptive process, but to help make the work better, have more depth, and be more significant through us all asking each other intelligent questions about the motives behind a piece of work. So I'm looking forward to discussion and to our discussion and to see how this position translates through your own experiences. So my first premise is that we as architects and property professionals primarily provide a service. And I think that's something that we forget, and particularly the educational establishment forgets, is that, you know, we're a service industry. And then that service is all about adding value to basically property assets and in meeting other people's aspirations. The premise, of course, is loaded. And the next question is, you know, what is value? Which is a whole other discussion, but I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. But there's a problem with how we are educated as designers and architects. And as much as we may have been told through our training, and as much as some might like to think so about themselves, we're not all infallible geniuses. What's important is the relevance of the artistic endeavor because of its potential to add to the well-being of others through good service, skill, and our abilities in the understanding of making buildings and places as in places and art, basically in making place beautiful. There's little significance or social good in just satisfying one's own idiosyncrasies through some form of aesthetic conceit, or in simply meeting the brief and technical requirements of keeping the weather out, or in physically manifesting the analysis of required size and the proximity of space. However, design is our work, and done well, intelligently, and from a depth of knowledge, and I mean an understanding of history combined with experience, with a focus on people and community, it too will work to add value to the quality of the resulting product, to the perception of the professional in the market, and to our own job satisfaction, and most importantly, to the communities we serve. But of course, it's not easy, and we cannot just change the diaspora at will. This quote for me is particularly poignant relative to everything we do by St. John Wilson here. And as I read, perhaps you'll have a quick read of this, of the quote on the screen. So the work encompasses many divergent things, and the resolution of these and success therein is subjective, assuming at least the building does not leak or collapse and otherwise provides a sound shell. It is all in the balance of firmness, commodity, and delight. But how does one discern what is substantial in our permissive society of today, where pretty much anything goes? Diversity is surely good in a meritocratic society with an entrepreneurial focus that provides choices and opportunities. But the insubstantial, thinly veiled, with impenetrable self-speak is not helpful in the advance of an art or a society. My second premise is that there's a history to art and architecture and how it is formed and developed over time, over the time of humans developing habitats and communities. There's a responsibility to that continuum. There's a language, or to be more precise, a number of languages and evolutions that have occurred that have brought us to where we are today in terms of the understanding, or more commonly, the misunderstanding of what art, design, and architecture is or can be. But that's not to say one forgoes a bit of swagger from time to time. The architect needs to be confident and be able to bring all the divergent factors together that St. John Wilson speaks about. Motives. How do we understand and support these? Information is important, as well as understanding of the thread of an idea and its origin. One should acknowledge sources, or for that matter, the lack of them. So just a very quick bit of art history, and this is a real nutshell, as I see it, in terms of how kind of the artistic idea developed and how we kind of moved away from using and acknowledging ideas in the past to where we are now, where, you know, people are very reluctant to acknowledge their sources in their work and pretend that these buildings have sprung out of their heads, you know, like some Athena, you know. So very quick, very quick art history. Poussiniste and Rubiniste, basically a discussion about draftsmanship versus the use of color, and which developed a change in view, and that eventually led to the Impressionists, the Cubists, and the modern movement. So that movement from that discussion between Poussin and Rubin to the turn of the century is 250 years of evolution, to the point where we decided to start to disregard history. Then, of course, there was Picasso. So Demoiselle d'Avignon, painted in 1907, he privately showed this to various people, but it wasn't exhibited till 1916. And at this point, basically, the movement started to move away from the classical and neoclassical Beaux-Arts schools, and they were almost swept away, particularly, of course, by the Bauhaus, which was in response to an arrived industrial age and to the availability of new materials such as reinforced concrete. Then we have the idea of precedence, and these change particularly with the introduction of these new materials that allowed us to build wider spans and much higher than ever before. We have things, icons like the Acropolis, which, you know, we've seen this form from this point used throughout the ages, everywhere from in public buildings to private houses. And one might have easily chosen Mycenae or Knossos, and there are many kind of choices to make in the classical canon. There too, running parallel is the intellectual debate about architectural form of Semper and Loggier relative to the idea of the primitive hut or the temple type as the basis for our gestalt for shelter. And of course, we have the orders, and the orders themselves aren't static. They provided a certain set of rules from the classical origins, and you had Vitruvius, Palladio, Serlio, Gibbs, etc., and that the orders themselves had a certain evolution. We then had movements in classical architectures, Chiswick House, and the development and evolution of language of a built form, which continued through to other forms, including, as in Washington, D.C., where derivative forms that are admittedly in these examples I'm giving, they're very Western European biased, and in this case at the time were appropriated by, of course, Jefferson for good reason, as it was seen at the time going back to the as it seemed at the time was him going back to the roots of democracy, and basically inevitably one thing leads to another. So you would think, but then there are further radical changes moving forward in artistic thought, and this demanded a break with tradition, basically a tabula rasa on which to move forward. And of course, we then have Corbusier, 11 years after Davignon was made public, and with the English edition being published in 1927, and he created a new canon, his 5 points, setting out a new order. Villa Savoye, 1929-1931, a move away from the traditional or the classical Palladian models. Interesting though, and this is quite interesting, is that the image of the white stripped down box came out of an existing traditional aesthetic and not purely functional, a notion from Le Corbusier's experience of the stripped down southern Mediterranean houses of the Greek islands. Interestingly, this developed into a global conceit, and the black and white photography and the misappropriation, the black and white photography that was used in magazines at the time, and the misappropriation by the US modernists of those visuals without fully understanding the context or the evolving form. So Corbusier actually used a lot of color in his buildings, which never came through in those early representations of his work abroad. And then across the pond, there was also Wright's prairie houses and the Usonian aesthetic of the mid-30s, which arguably was a position that was more grounded in its context, tried to be grounded in culture and landscape. So decisions. So that leaves us with a dilemma. There are stylistic dividing lines that have emerged. Unfortunately, too many saw this or see this still as an either-or position, as opposed to an opportunity for diversity in designing places. Types of choices. We like, as human beings, we like to classify, we like to set rules and be reductive. And with this reductive lens, one might cruelly see these choices in this way, as I'm illustrating here in these 4 points. Just give you a moment to read them quickly. But how does one choose, the language of built form? Well, we really need to be careful what we wish for, because you need to have rigor in your decision making, and that's required. This image here, this is maybe a one-off joke or a bit of fun, but in my view, it's not architecture. It's a stage that is theater. It's something entirely moving away from what we're trying to do, which is make quality places and spaces that have a reference to the continuum of the art form, as are these. There's follies, there's just a whim about what something should be, and there's speculation on what might be, all of which don't really have a particular grounding as architecture, again, in my view. Or you could have something worse, which is something that you can end up with something that's not even suited for the purpose it was conceived, as with Zaha's firehouse in Switzerland, which never was a firehouse and ended up, I think, as a museum in the end. Or even worse, you can end up with nothing. You can end up with the lowest common level of just the mundane and placeless. So what I'm looking to say is that our process must be source-driven and be informed intellectually as well as practically. One should design from knowledge, not only with the facts of the problem to hand, cite the context, climate, legislation, client aspirations, but taking those into account as a holistic system in the proposed material and cultural expression. Don't forsake tradition, culture, and art. Nicholas Salignaro has much to say about this, as does Norbert Schultz, Heidegger, Chris Alexander. It's about divining the raw and the cooked. Salignaro says, the problem boils down to critics judging buildings for their image and not from direct personal experience. Critics on the whole don't care if things work or if they really fit. Critics also depend upon famous architects and on the major engineering firms who those architects work for, and thus never dare to criticize their work. Architects designing strictly for the admiration of other architects and critics being dishonest in their duty results in a profession that is unlikely to break out of a vicious circle of irresponsible self-validation. And I don't know if you've seen Nick's Salignaro's articles that he's been publishing online free, but they're absolutely fantastic, I think. So where does this leave us when we stride out into, for instance, inhospitable locations and outer space, for that matter? will it be a valid response to continue to build as we might like from known contexts and for community, or will we be driven to something else? Who knows? Who's going to be the arbiter, moving forward? Will we be made to forsake sense of scale and place, ignore the phenomena of door, threshold, window, and the things that ground us from the shifting priorities in the world around us? Well, I hope not. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing now, I think. Great.
Thank you, Scott. There's certainly a lot of content in there that we could kind of dwell upon. I had my own question that I want to just start off with, and then we can open up to the floor. We're talking about kind of cultural relevance and kind of trying to, well, one, argue that we should be using good precedents, kind of continue building within a continuum of architectural history. Just to complicate things a little bit more, my question for you is, in a world which is very globalized, where we have such kind of diverse extremes, just general diverse communities, particularly in our cities, how is that even defined now, cultural relevance? Where do you start when everyone is from completely different backgrounds in the same environments? Is precedent appropriate because it's appropriate to the client itself, or are you saying precedent is appropriate to the context in which the building sits in, or are you talking about precedent within kind of the wider architectural kind of architectural history framework?
So I think our experience at the moment is just here in England. You go to each city and the architecture, the new architecture all looks the same. It's kind of bit of brick, bit of render, bit of timber cladding. Buildings with that are all flushed up. So you've got windows, doors, walls with no weathering details. So this is England. It does rain from time to time, and heavier in some places than others. So I think just first of all, the climatic necessities are being ignored, and they're being ignored for stylistic reasons, and that's quite disappointing. Why do we buildings with flush skins where you've got lots of weathering and rain? Why are we building rendered buildings which inevitably get completely covered in mold and moss in certain locations where they're kind of enclosed? I mean, it just opens up a whole range of questions. And that issue about cultural significance in a global atmosphere is quite important. But if we're going to avoid every single city in the world looking exactly the same, we need to first of all respect what's there. So the gestalt of place, by keeping certain buildings intact, so that the place doesn't dissolve into some kind of global vocabulary of nowhereness, and then try to draw on that and draw on those patterns of development directly from the place, as opposed to try to remake them. I think that's, I know it is a challenge, but it's how one. And then my further point is that comes from education, people understanding how to try to read a place without trying to kind of completely retranslate it, without trying to completely remove it, but read it constructively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then another thing you kind of pointed out was kind of this delicate balance that architects always need to try and find between kind of familiarity and novelty. I think it's maybe human nature that they like an element of novelty, of freshness and newness that's maybe relevant to only them in the whole wide world. But it does need to kind of be contextual and kind of in keeping with the general area and the context. So even in our own network, I think we all have a different point on that scale, on that spectrum, where some of us might think, we value novelty a little bit more than familiarity. So like, there's kind of the canonical classicists, and then there's kind of a bit more of the inventive classicists like Lutyens, and I would even say you, Bob. So yeah, that's an interesting point. And maybe it also depends on the building type. For example, I think the art museums and kind of airports, you may find that balance is slightly different than your kind of residential dwelling. So I'm curious to hear from the rest of you if you have any initial questions or things you'd like to just raise for discussion. Yes, Bob, go ahead. Just chime in whenever.
There we are. Well, I never resist saying something. Just following up on your point, actually, about what I call cultural relativity. Was my work in Beirut. Because I was working with a Beiruti architect, he told me things I didn't know about Beirut. I would not have known had I just flown in and got out of an aeroplane and looked out the aeroplane and said, "Hey guys, it's all about pointy arches." That is actually what most international architects did, if they even thought they were going to relate it to anything local. There were really quite complex things about the meaning of things in the Lebanon. He could tell if he was in a Muslim village or a Christian village just by looking at the buildings, not the mosque or church or anything like that, just by looking at the buildings. So that there's always that complexity out there. And, I mean, as you know, Dan, I think, as well, Scott, that we generally investigate the history of somewhere before we design there. I mean, it's an elementary thing to do. Because we're just writing the next chapter in the book. You might as well know what the book says before you write the next chapter, and that can apply culturally as well. I just want to share an anecdote, actually, Scott, with you. It was a talk that George Samuel Smith gave in the building centre, and he came away from it saying, and I was at it, and he said, "Do you sometimes you feel you're the only sane person in the asylum?" Because one of the other schemes was absolutely staggering. In order to keep a facade completely sheer, because he wanted a sheer facade, this is clearly more important than anything else, he had the sills flush, but actually the water went inwards towards the window. It was then drained in a little channel about 10 millimeters across into little drain pipes which went out somewhere. Well, you can work out how long they'd take to block up, about 3 days probably. You think, I'm sorry, are you so inadequate that you can't design a building that actually works? You have to think up something really that simply will not work in order to prove that you are being original. It's completely bonkers. It's kind of a mission of failure, really. I mean, is actually originality, which is fine, nothing wrong with originality, and design based on doing something that doesn't work. I find that quite breathtaking.
Yeah.
But one or two of your things, actually, I'm going to share, because you may have heard some of these before, but these are things which I've always found useful. And one of my favorite sayings, which I think I made up, of course, is anyone who thinks they're a genius isn't. Is that there are very few geniuses around, and educating a whole profession in order to satisfy who these people are going to be. I mean, God knows who they're going to be. 1 a generation, 2 a generation, if you even believe the concept, is completely mad. Now, all it means is you get people who can't do anything because they've been educated to be geniuses. And the thing about it is, if someone like Palladio or Lutyens, which let's admit they were geniuses, actually they did know how to build buildings, funnily enough. They did actually. The idea that a normal training would get in the way of a genius is completely ridiculous. The other one I wanted to share was the concept of the avant-garde, which comes into this. I mean, many of you probably know what the origin of an avant-garde. Avant-garde was as a Napoleonic military term for a skirmishing force which would go out in front of an army, and they kind of made life difficult for the army for a bit, and the army would catch up. Nice idea. Well, what happened with the avant-garde is that the idea that you do this artistically, but what they forgot was the army, and it was everybody else, actually got fed up and went away and went off somewhere else. So this sort of small group were left forever skirmishing with ordinary people. The concept never really worked. And only one other one about this is the thing about jokes in buildings. Right? I did that. Is that in normal life, if you tell a joke once, it's a good joke. It's quite amusing. And if you tell it to the same people twice, well, it's possibly moderately amusing. But if you keep on telling the joke, it gets really boring and it gets really annoying. So telling jokes with buildings is actually a futile task. So I just thought I'd share those little snippets with you.
Thanks, Bob. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to discuss or raise in the context of precedent? And how do you, as maybe a designer, kind of...
I have a small point to make on your comment about Lutyens, because Lutyens actually never went to a school of architecture. He learnt his craft by cycling around the houses and the buildings that were going up or being repaired around his neighbourhood. And that sort of goes on. He was observant, which is something that people are never taught. They're not taught to look because that means copying, and that's the worst thing you can do. So when Lutyens goes gets the job in New Delhi, he produces a beautiful crossbreed of a Western palace with architectural features of the location where he is. And it doesn't look macabre; it looks perfect. And this is because he actually had a sense of humour about it, but he was also open to observing, and that's something that we don't do because it's, as I say, it's simply to do with copying. And if you admit to any precedent, you've copied it. This is where this sort of circular problem lies: is that the search for innovation is at the point end of the architectural army, and as Bob says, it's the rest of the profession is grubbing around building warehouses and stuff. The avant-garde is out there somewhere, completely detached from the rest of it, and everybody's pretending that nobody is looking at anybody else's work, or nobody's looking at anything. They're just sitting in a studio, just creating things, and this desperate search. I mean, there's nothing worse than, I remember in School of Architecture, nothing worse than being told that's boring. If something was boring, that was just, you may as well just leave the room. So, and yet, why not actually start off with stuff that is relevant, that is simple. Start off with simple things. I have an assistant in the office who's an architectural technologist, and they had to do a final project and detail it. This is architectural technology, not architecture. But he and I said to him, why don't you do a house? Just draw it up properly, draw every detail, do the doors, everything. And his tutor told him that was not possible because it had to be something original. This is a guy who's been, he's 21, he's just done 3 years of training. How on earth do they expect him to be original? So he just photocopied various bits of drawings he found and presented it rather nicely, and he got a very good grade. And so it's not really even training; it's just a sort of abuse of young people, really. I would just get rid of architectural schools altogether. It's just pointless. 7 years to be de-skilled in the art of looking. That's my thought.
It's quite interesting.
I agree with you, Jan. Absolutely. It's 100%. What are schools for if not to learn from precedents and to learn how to be competent at what you're doing? But they don't teach competence as far as most people that I've studied with, and most people that are still graduating from architecture schools are telling me the same thing. I'd love to hear some exceptions, and I'd love to see a change, and I see some promising things happening around the world, but too few, frankly. Sorry, Scott, go on.
No, it's okay. Just great, because all that supports, in a sense, my position. When I was doing the Winchester lectures, and I would ask architects, and we had a very huge variety of people who came to give the talks, of course. And I would ask them questions like, so, you know, in your work, I see this and that. And they wouldn't admit, even from the modernists, they would not admit that they took an idea from another modernist. They would explain their way around it in a way that sounded like they invented the idea of whatever they were doing. You know, I said, well, you got a bit of Louis Kahn in there. You know, that's, you know, right from X and X building, you know. And they're like, and then they talked all around it. They didn't admit the precedent. The only person who does that very well is John Party. I've told people this before. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. Some of you have heard this, but he says, well, my stuff comes directly from the influence of the, you know, the 1930s California architects, and that's where I take and I try to recreate that. So whether he's right or wrong about doing it here in England is one thing, but he admits it, and that was refreshing when he just came out and showed his precedents, showed pictures of old buildings that he was trying to copy, you know, in, you know, slightly different ways. The other thing about precedent is, you know, the traditional classical idiom, you know, in a colonial sense, when you go down south to America, you know, it was transformed with porches and verandas and different ways of using those elements in a way that may have been not used here in the more blocky forms, perhaps, that we're used to seeing those kind of large-scale classical buildings.
I have two things, if I may. One is your point, Jan, about architecture schools. I've actually asked publicly, how do people get on who teach in universities? You know, how do they advance their careers? They don't do it because their pupils are successful, because if you're an architect, it takes you about 5 or 10 years, by which time, you know, everyone's kind of forgotten that. You do it by impressing other academics. And how do you impress other academics? By being really obscure and difficult. That's the way and this doesn't just apply to architecture, it applies quite widely. The other one is about innovation. I call this a value transfer. Is that in a capitalist society, innovation in terms of in manufacture and production is generally reckoned to be a good thing, you know, a benefit. It's good, and probably correct. You know, you get competition and you innovate, and then you sell it on, you get better. But if you look at all that, and I did this for my book, which I hope you're all going to read, Time for Architecture. I've developed this in considerable detail. Is that if you actually look at all the measures, people, you get innovation. You know, firms do which country is most innovative, which industry is most innovative. It's all technical. The idea that what you do is there's no actual obvious merit in aesthetic innovation. What you do is you say, look, innovation is good in manufacturing, therefore it's good anywhere, whatever you do. This isn't true. You know, none of these measures say, you know, China is good because it makes things look weird, because actually that's aesthetic innovation. No, it's this idea that you take something, you know, it's rather like when you sell white goods on television. You say, you know, I think you need to invest in a new washing machine. Well, it's not an investment. It loses its value like the next day. But they've taken the idea of investment from one place and transferred it to another. And that's what's happened with innovation. So people use the word innovation because it carries with it this aura of success and advancement and so on and so on. But there is no seamless merit in aesthetic innovation.
In fact, I think that as the article that was circulated actually makes a really lovely point at the end of it, is that an emphasis. So if the designer sets out to innovate, or any craftsman sets out to innovate, is usually puts him at a disadvantage in terms of creativity, because he's eliminated all the avenues and parameters that could be incorporated to truly innovate, and only it focuses on those that look as if they're going to be innovative. There's it actually stifles innovation completely. And as we see in the architecture world, there's nothing changed for 75 years. You know, it's the same stuff that's being trotted out. So all this attempt to innovation is they're just going around in a vortex. But as we said earlier, nobody's willing to admit, nobody's going to be the first person to say, I'm going to get out of the vortex, because that would be a terror, and they wouldn't know where to go. They've been stuck in this loop for so long. And it is, that the article is very interesting because it sort of opened up my eyes to how different cultures, okay, this is talking about fourth century Chinese, but still, you know, we think we have the same attitude to innovation, Bob, as you said, but this is something fairly new. I mean, you look back at the Renaissance, you know, in Florence, they weren't innovating, they were trying to build like the Romans. So the fact that they thought that the baptistry was a Roman building, got it wrong, and various other mistakes. And also they were trying to build like the Romans as opposed to the Gothic, which was from the north, which is from the Holy Roman Empire. So it was a deeply political thing. And there was absolutely nothing about innovation in there. And yet it's always portrayed as the Renaissance as the rebirth. Well, it sort of was, but there was a reason and a politics behind it. So but they did actually, they weren't trying to do what we ascribe their motives to be at all in history.
The other one is that originality is unavoidable. If you, in a philosophical sense, if you copy something exactly from the past, you're doing something they wouldn't have done then. In other words, they wouldn't have actually done precisely that. You can't help but to some extent be original. It's unavoidable. You know, no one, when they did the Parthenon, you know, was going to produce an exact copy of the Parthenon. So, you know, but they did it in America, you know. So that actually is a very specific product of that particular period in America, and will always forever be so. So you'll always be of your time, and you'll always be original. So just basically get on with it.
One thing I wanted to add about that point about innovation is that, like, practically speaking, innovation can be a very big risk to our clients. Or you have to have a hell of a lot of money to do bespoke testing to pass building regs. Some of these materials, they might be flammable and you may not have known, you know, things like this. So this obsession about innovation is interesting and slightly contradictory in terms of what we see as good architecture. So it's just interesting why is it that in our profession, the awards go to innovation, it seems.
Oh, there are actually several. I mean, I again, in my book, which I shall plug again, I actually list all the references, you know, to innovation. I mean, people keep doing it, saying you actually can go on innovative architecture courses. You know, I think Portsmouth has one saying architectural innovation. That's why you're going there. But I think I don't know if you're aware of Frank Gehry's employment contract. It specifically excludes his clients from suing him for building failures. I mean, clever chap.
I remember when I used to work for William Whitfield, who was innovative. He couldn't sort of go all the way to doing traditional work, so everything was innovative, and all the elevations were flush, the copings were flush, and all the rest of it. And there were so many building failures that we used to joke that there should have been an RIBA workstage Z for litigation at the end of the job. Almost every job ended up in court.
This is the problem. I mean, our celebrated architects, I mean, funny enough, Bill Martin, who's joined us tonight from this, we've had a little discussion about Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, and that, you know, he's so celebrated, oh, fantastic, but, you know, his buildings failed all the time. Everything he did just needed work. It was just, even the small houses he built in the Midwest, you know, some of the Usonian houses, they were inadequate foundations. They have so many issues, regardless of, you know, their spatial qualities. They did have issues, but you know, and that's like almost inexcusable, because we're supposed to be architects. We're supposed to be serving the people that we build buildings for, and they spend their money, good money, to have a building that doesn't leak. You know, and that's got to be priority one. And then, you know, on top of that, though, we've then got the commitment, the responsibility to a continuum of kind of artistic endeavor, and that.
I kind of want to maybe turn the conversation around to a different direction. You know, if we're saying we should be choosing precedent, in the act of choosing precedent, you know, how do you choose what is appropriate precedent? You know, do you think it's something that you need to tell the client, or do you do the other way around? Do you ask the client for a vision and aspiration, and you find a precedent appropriate for that? What would be your kind of personal kind of process for that, Scott?
Well, that's our job and this comes down to the point that Jan was making about looking properly and looking deeply at something. And of course, we're not trained to do that. As we all discussed, we're trained to be our own little geniuses working in our own little garret somewhere, producing amazing things that no one had ever seen before. So we're not taught to look properly. And I think, you know, as far as the modern idiom is concerned, the modernist idiom is concerned, Louis Kahn in his essay on the brick, I mean, that in a way was a good start. You know, the phenomena of that simple building block of, you know, stacking one thing on top of the other and the thing having its own inherent properties. And we can use that, you know, again, in this forum and this group of people who are interested in building buildings well, just looking back at traditional architecture, you know, things like, you know, big thick walls, thermal mass, the things that not only make the climate of the building sustainable and you know green in today's jargon. You know, it's a shame we can't build more houses with thatched roofs. They're an incredibly sustainable way of constructing a roof. They're, you know, inherently insulating. You know, but then we've got practical issues about fire and people's you know, perceptions of the safety issues involved in that. That's just, you know, one example of many we can you know, choose from. In terms of and then, you know, once you do that, then you have this depth of material to start to develop, you know, with you know, the use of precedence of detail and architectural language from. In fact, Jan's house is very interesting, where he's using these new clay. They're not new. They've been around for, I don't know what, like the modernists, 100 years or so, haven't they, Jan? Those clay blocks.
18 around in.
Yeah. So you know, there's stuff that's around that, but as Bob was saying, everybody wants to change. You know, it all has to be different. You know, from one day to the next. If it's not seen as being something new and improved, it's not any good, which is shameful. You know?
I think it's interesting that architects that definitely have a tendency to kind of post-rationalize and over-philosophize kind of design principles. And it's always interesting because actually when, you know, clients hire us to design them something, and actually clients speak in very simple terms, you know, almost like I like this or I don't like this. I personally think, you know, buildings are kind of a reflection of our clients' value systems and their own vision. So our job is to translate these emotions into kind of, you know, build some sort of building form. Well, do you feel we need to have more of these discussions actually with our clients about, you know, their perspectives, their ideas, their feelings, the psychological view of how they kind of see this building coming to life, to be able to choose good precedents? I always think we could do more, you know, talking to our clients about the vision. Sometimes we jump straight into kind of a building program, you know.
Well, we have to stop treating them as if they're stupid. You know, we have to tell them, get it out there. So this is what I'm trying to do for you. Do you agree? You know, why don't you agree? Let's have a discussion about it. I mean, they're not stupid. They've earned enough to build themselves a new house. I mean, they're not totally ignorant, and certainly some of them have, you know, good aesthetic sensibilities or philosophical sensibilities that would allow us, if we gave them a chance, to explain, you know, we understand what you want and this is how we're trying to get there for you. And, you know, definitely, I think you're quite right. We need to have those more open conversations instead of, you know, trust me, I'm the architect. You know, I mean, we you know, that's not a good approach.
There is a problem with clients in a sense, because the profession has kind of abandoned all precedents and everything else that went with it. But when you talk to clients, they basically trawl the internet for stuff they like. And then you're presented with a dozen completely contradictory images. And I remember one particular joyful client, and it was I think it was in the middle of the Fens, and I said, well, gather some drawings, photographs together, what you like, and he did a job of that, and he found one that he particularly liked, which was a lovely, fantastic, multi-million-pound modernist house on the west coast of California. So, you know, how do you engage with that person's aspirations? You know, they're untethered. They live on the edge of a stone or brick village, and they've chosen an image from overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I mean, I don't know how I can satisfy that person. So there's absolutely nothing there that helps me.
Tell them to employ another architect. So that's a short answer. I mean, it does depend on the client. I mean, some clients, you know, are gasping for any kind of idea, and you sort of kind of give it to them. They usually come to you in the first place because they sort of like what you do. And I think some of you know, I mean, I often present 5 or 6 alternatives. And so one family actually had a family vote on it as a sealed vote on which one they would choose. And they always choose the one with the Palladian portico. I never understand that. But, however much...
William had a comment. Sorry, Bob.
Yeah, no, I'll be quiet now. It's okay.
William, I think you've been raising your hand for quite some time now. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I've been trying to get some attention. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
You know, it's interesting, you know, when I talk to my clients, I try to learn from them as to what they are actually trying to achieve. I try to determine what their goals are, you know, aesthetically, functionally, you know, economically. But I also try to educate them a little bit because, you know, someone mentioned earlier, you know, they come to you with photos. I actually encourage my clients to go out and explore. And I actually tell them to go to Google and type in, you know, what they think they're looking for and click images. So when you do that, you get a whole series of images, you know, just get websites, and then you can kind of filter through that. And I tell them, narrow it down 3, 4, 5. And then that begins the dialogue, because you have to, the dialogue is visual. It's not just words. Part of the problem I have is, you know, whether it's a commercial project or a residential project, you know, I get the pictures also of the modernist house on the California coast, and I'm on the East Coast of the United States, not the West Coast. It's a completely different climate and so forth, but at least it begins a dialogue. And I try to kind of bring them up to speed with what's happening in our profession by explaining, because many of them will say to me, well, I want modern. And I said, well, that's great, but modernism is 100 years old now. So what exactly do you mean by modern? And then we go to the images, and then we try to discern, you know, what it is they mean by modern. Very often they don't mean modern at all. They mean traditional, but they want it kind of interpolated into a modern context, which I absolutely love that, because that's where the creativity of what we do can be put to its best use. So, you know, to me, the design process with the client is very much a dialogue with the client. So it becomes, as I say to my clients, I said, look, you know what you sort of know what you want, and I know how to put buildings together. So between the two of us, we're going to do it together. And I try to encourage that with my clients. You know, some clients are not interested. They just, you know, oh, I like this, what you did for, you know, this, do the same thing. And it's like, okay, you know, that's great. But, you know, there's this whole idea that, you know, we have to innovate all the time, and that the awards go to the innovators. You know, I just think that the way to be a good architect is to understand all of the languages of all of the stylings, if you want to, you know, break it down to styles, and then examine the context in which the client wants to build, and develop an aesthetic that fits that context, fits that climate zone, addresses sustainability, because we have to address sustainability, and in some way should be reasonably economical in its execution. I mean, even for a client with an unlimited budget, it's just not appropriate to simply spend money for the sake of innovation. in my opinion. I mean, I'll give you an example. Is Calatrava's train station in New York City, with the the concrete. I said, it cost $4 billion to build that. I said, you know what, why don't we spend $2 billion, do something a little less ambitious, and solve homelessness with the other $2 billion? What do you say? No one wants to do that. Everybody wants to, anyway, thank you for that. Had to vent a little.
You heard when I was in New York, they were the New York Transit Company was having to put their fares up to pay for the Calatrava thing.
Yeah, exactly.
There were perfectly sensible objections to that. So why should we, the citizens of New York, have to put up with higher fares because Calatrava can't stick within a budget? It's
right.
However, he's a genius, of course. He'd like to do that.
No, I have great respect for Calatrava. I just question the wisdom of approaching design from that perspective.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's the one I find the most successful things I've done is where I sat down and actually drawn it with the client
Yes.
on the spot. There's two things about that. One is that people like it because they feel they're part of it, and the second is they're much less likely to change it halfway through because it's their design. It's your design. You designed it. I just helped you. It's but it's a nice dialogue, and if you can get people to do that, I find it very, 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 very successful.
Yes, I agree. I mean, where do we think things are going in the future? I mean, where are things going? I mean, we talked about history. Scott talked about history, and I mentioned, modernism being 100 years old. So, you go back to the Renaissance, and they were mimicking the Romans because it was a rebirth of the discovery after the Dark Ages of Greek and Roman architecture. So they're trying to replicate that. So it gets progressively more detailed. You get to the Rococo and you get some of these very detailed styles. And then you start to see in art, you start to see Impressionism and you see the picturesque, as Scott had some pictures up earlier. And then as you get into the 20th century, then you get modernism where you're stripping off all of the detail that you spent centuries developing. And now you're working towards the essence of what a building actually is. So you've gone from one extreme to the other. Where do we go from here? Once you've stripped everything off and you're down to the essence of a building, as the modernists say, where do you go? If you go backwards, you're going backwards. So where does the future lie for what we're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the Bauhaus sense, they're not saying it's the essence of the building, are they? They're saying it's a new, industrial aesthetic for an industrial age. I mean, if we were stripping a building back to its essence, there we are back to Norberg Schultz again, to, going back to the idea of dwelling and, what does that mean? And what does that type, look like for us? Whereas again, the modernists, they're the ones who stylized more than anyone else, stylized architecture. Saying this is what it should look like. And then you have Illinois Institute of Technology and their draconian red pen method of design, teaching design. It just goes on and on from there.
I think one to look at the future, the best thing you do is look at the future. And I know that George, for example, and it's taking place in a number of talks at schools of architecture, and and amongst the students, the idea that traditional architecture is some sort of horror, you can't possibly touch, really isn't there. There's a sort of curiosity for it. I personally, I think it's a good thing. I mean, having, in the end, if you're a student, which they're not stupid, having this same stuff handed down to them and told this is the same stuff, actually they kind of get that. That's actually not really very interesting anymore. There's other things out there. So, I think in my view, all we can really do is to encourage openness and curiosity. I mean, openness and curiosity. I mean, who knows where it's going to go? If you know what's happening in the future, let me know, and I'll buy the shares now. But
well, I think people are. I think generally the population, is yearning for a little more meaning, and I think Diana, you talked about the globalization of cities, and then Scott, you talked about cities all looking alike. You put it well. I forget how you put it, but anyway, the problem is people are yearning for culture. I think what's missing in architects and the architecture profession is the academics and the critics have, no offense to you, Bob, you're not that kind of academic. The academics and critics are all patting each other on the back while actually not serving the students very well at all. The students, of course, are not the ones that are ideological and have swallowed these ideas of, oh, you have to be innovative, you have to be of this time, as if you're not. I think the problem is architecture's been a bit stuck in an ideological state, and Jan, like you said, it's observation and learning from precedent, and Bob said, you know, we're writing a book here. It's the book of the built environment. Learn the last few chapters and then move on. But the very people that are supposed to be the best and teaching architecture, and also the Starchitects, are actually turning their back on culture and continuing a story. Everything is just, in their world, everything is just an object. You know, it's very materialistic, and it's totally bereft of, a lot of it is just bereft of any story. There's no narrative. It's just sitting there without anything that really talks to people. It's cool for about 5 minutes, but that's it.
I think if you want to look to the future, you look to what's happening culturally, not architecture, because
Exactly.
architecture will follow culture, the general direction of things.
Yeah.
Architecture is quite a slow process. And I hate to mention the word, but populism is a very widespread phenomenon, which has very bad sides to it. I mean, it's realized it has very bad sides to it, but it's actually a reflection of something where if you like, a counter-globalization, a counter-homogenization tendency that's out there. And architecture will eventually catch up with this, because it has to, and it always does. I think, you know, I firmly believe that the global era really finished with the 2008 recession. These things move. These things move quite slowly. There's a very good book called The Road to Somewhere, which is actually traces what's effectively a new tendency. People are more interested in the place that they come from and where they live, and they're beginning to kick against, if you like, internationalization. Now, as I say, it has its bad sides, but it is a cultural phenomenon, and I think one needs to recognize it and find the good things in it.
It's quite interesting. That all leads, to what will be my next talk, which is architecture is a toaster. It's the kind of commodification, turning an piece of art to, it's a product, you know, and what do we do about that where it becomes so culturally devoid? It just becomes the next throwaway appliance, you know.
The thing is that for many decades now, architecture as a profession has been intrinsically bound up with the elite. So in the book The Road to Somewhere, he splits up the world into this sort of the anywheres travel around the globe, and everywhere's like home, whereas the somewheres have got they are bound to the place, to the geography of where they come from. That doesn't mean that you can't, as an immigrant, arrive in a place and become of that place as well. But architecture is, just by the parameters of getting into the profession, it's a 5-year course. I honestly think it's there to brainwash you, to beat anything sensible out of you before you leave, and that becomes your world. You know, the elite, they used to joke about Norman Foster, wasn't it? That is, what's it called, seagull architecture, where they fly in, crap all over the place, and fly off again. And this is what everyone aspires to. If you're a great architect, you do this in your jet, and the client pays your your fee in aviation fuel. It's just
a lot of that lies in public procurement as well. Is guilty of that. You know, we've had it here in Winchester. They run a competition, or they go out to a bid, and of course the only people who can afford to do this are the big practices who are willing to sacrifice the time to to put in a bid for a big town center development, or the developers who they're teaming up with. And before you know it, you've got that exact thing, you know, spaceship architecture, because the guys doing it don't really care. They send the, you know, junior architect down to do the contextual analysis and to convince, take all the flack, convincing the locals that this is the best thing since sliced bread for the community. But it's nothing of the sort, because it's posturing by the architects themselves, you know, who come and land their creations in the middle of wherever.
You know why? Well, originally the 5-year course in Britain, because actually Britain came quite late to full-time architectural education. The reason it was 5 years was because there was so much technical stuff to learn. Well, they stopped teaching the technical stuff, and of course the tutors didn't want to sacrifice their, you know, 5-year, all that wonderful pay they were getting for turning out late and teaching people strange things. So they filled up the bit that was going to be technical with all kinds of weird stuff. I went to one where the student that won the prize, it's actually something I knew, it's a relation as a matter of fact, that's why I went there, was his building, his concept of a building wasn't even a building. It was based on the way that a flea jumped. Brilliant, you know, brilliant. And of course that absolutely blew him away. So he got the #1 student prize, and it was employed by Richard Rogers. There you go. That's the key to success.
Oh gosh. Well, anyways, we are out of time, unfortunately. I'm conscious people are probably very hungry and want to eat their dinners. But thank you again, Scott, for that really thought-provoking presentation.
Thanks.
Lots of really interesting ideas there. Just as a closing remark, do you want to kind of give us one kind of final summarized answer of what you think good architecture is, maybe particularly for the students actually out there?
You know, I just think we have to be more attentive to our clients. I mean, some of the best projects, Bob talked about, you know, some of the, you know, projects, the best projects, some more satisfying projects, but the ones for me are the ones where, you know, the client keeps come back, I bump into them somewhere and they say, oh, you know, we still love the house you did for us. And it never got in a magazine. It never won an award, but my client is very satisfied, and in probably most of those cases, I am satisfied that I not only, you know, created the comfortable box for them, but that I somehow celebrated or rose to the occasion of doing architecture. So it was that sublime combination of both of those things, without having to shout about it and get acclaims from my peers and colleagues. Those for me are probably the most successful, satisfying pieces of work.
Spot on.
Thanks, Scott. Just so you all know, we have another Tag Talk planned for early October, which will be given by our member Radek Chanas on his research on Bulstrode Park. So just watch your inboxes. We'll be sending out details shortly. Otherwise, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you for taking part today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you, Scott.